In Driving the Green Book, award-winning broadcaster Alvin Hall takes us on a journey through America's haunted racial past with the legendary Green Book as our guide. Hi, it's Brenda with HEC Books, where we discuss books with the authors who write them. If you're new to our channel, make sure you subscribe for more great content like this. Now, let's meet Alvin Hall to talk about the personal journey that he took to discover the Negro Motorist Green Book. Alvin Hall, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Brenda. I'm glad to be here.
Tell us, what is the Green Book?
The Green Book, whose official name is the Negro Motorist Green Book, was created in 1936 by Victor Hugo Green and his wife Alma, who at the time lived in Harlem. Victor was a postman in New Jersey, Hackensack to be specific. During the summer, he and his wife would take trips to go to Richmond, Virginia to visit Alma's relatives. And on their way there, they would encounter aggravations. They could not use bathrooms. They could not buy food. They could not stop at a place to sleep. Victor became frustrated about this and decided to create a publication to help people find the services they wanted when they were traveling. At first, he went among his friends, gathered information, and so the first Green Book really focused on primarily New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, and a little of New England. The next one expanded upon that, and then by 1938, people started to hear about the Green Book, and it gradually started to spread across America. It was published every April or May at the beginning of the summer holiday season so that people could use it when they were on the road.
This was such an integral part of Black life, especially traveling, and yet so many people don't even know that it ever existed, including a lot of Black Americans. How did you find it?
I found out about the Green Book when I was on an airplane, not even in a car. When I fly around, I typically like to buy magazines, so I buy a stack and I'll go through them and read them and leave them on the plane. And in this case, I saw a little sidebar that mentioned the Negro Motorist Green Book. This was in about 2015. I thought, what is this? I've never heard of this publication. So I said to myself, when I get back to New York, I would go to the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture and I would see what it was about. I came back and I discovered that the Schomburg has the largest collection of green books in the United States. I think they have all of the editions except one. And at the same time, I met this wonderful librarian there named Myra Liriano, and she spread them out on the desk in front of me. So in those days, you could actually touch them. That's now no longer possible. But the New York Public Library has digitized all of them now, so they're available online. So like everybody, Brenda, if you were doing this, where would you look if you saw the Green Book the first time?
I would look where I'm living, I suppose, right?
Exactly.
Or like where I have connections to, right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I looked at the city nearest to where I was born, Tallahassee, Florida. And I was born south of Tallahassee in the country. And we would go to Tallahassee to buy groceries, go to the doctor. And much to my surprise, there was a single listing for the Abner, Virginia Motel on Railroad Avenue. We drove up and down Railroad Avenue all the time when we went to town, and I never saw it. So my first journey with the Green Book had to start at that place, and that opened up this journey that became the book.
This was like finding hidden treasure.
It really was, because the Abner, Virginia was located in this part of the city. It was shielded, it had live oak trees with moss hanging over it, a little pond across the way. And you could imagine how Count Basie's band or James Brown and his touring company or the Motown Revue had pulled up to this, and this would be a safe harbor for them, the way it was sequestered, the way it was seemingly safe and quiet from the troubles of the world.
What was that moment like when you saw all of these Green Books? That just must have been like emotional.
It was almost like a part of history had been revealed to me. First of all, they were smaller than I had imagined because they were designed to fit in glove boxes of cars during that period of time.
Like a pocket guide?
Exactly, like a pocket guide. How the covers evolved over the years as printing techniques changed. How there were special issues that talked about railroad travel or airline travel as the options changed for African Americans. So it was like watching this arc of history that I had no idea about until I sat there at that conference table.
I felt like that as I was reading your book, too. It was like this was a chronicle of this very specific time in history. And
it really is, because I think my journey is the journey that many people would like to go on if they had the time to do this type of thing. And because I work in television, I work in radio, I could structure this in a particular way. A road trip. What better way to discover what the Green Book meant than to go on a road trip? And so I have taken 2 road trips. The first one started when I learned about the Green Book, and then the fates delivered a phone call from Jeremy Grange at BBC Wales in the UK. Why would somebody from the UK call me about the Green Book? He had read about it and thought it would make a great program and asked me if I would host that program. And I said yes immediately. When we were thinking about how to structure that trip, we wanted it to be through space and time. The space, Tallahassee, Florida, via the historic civil rights route through Montgomery, Selma, Memphis, ending in Ferguson. Through time, from my past, I was born south of Tallahassee in segregation, through to the current events at that time, Michael Brown's death in Ferguson, Missouri, and the founding of Black Lives Matters movement.
one of the reasons a lot of African Americans didn't know about it was because sometimes you didn't really travel for good reasons.
Exactly.
And it was expensive, and it was an era where it wasn't a possibility for loads of families, right?
I think my family is typical. We were raised poor, but I always say we were raised po because we couldn't afford the O-R in the word. And so we didn't travel. We didn't go on vacations. When we did travel, it was to visit my Uncle Louis in Lake City, Florida, or maybe to go to Jacksonville to visit a relative. Those were overnight trips. So we didn't need a green book for that. Uncle's son would come by in his panel truck or his car, and we would all crowd in the car. We'd always start at like 3 or 4 in the morning, and he would drive off down the road, and he'd be humming some spiritual as he looked in the rearview mirror. And the way they sat in the front seat was Uncle's son, my grandmother, and my mother, and then we would be on the bench seat in the back of the car. That's the way it was. So we didn't have any money for travel, and the only time we traveled was for relatives, when somebody was sick, for a funeral, or maybe for some church celebration.
So the Green Book is named for its founder, Victor Green. How did he take it from that idea to building really like a publishing company in a way, right?
It did become a publishing company. Victor worked as a postman in Hackensack, New Jersey. At the time, there were 2 postmen's unions, one for white postmen and one for black postmen. Victor was able to tap into people that he knew in both of those unions, and they would tell him about places in cities where they delivered mail that would be appropriate for his travel guide. And that's how he began to source the listings in the travel guide. In the early days, he and Alma would visit the places in order to see what the quality was if they provided services that were appropriate for his publication. Later on, as the Green Book grew and started to cover America, Victor couldn't travel all those places because he was a postman in Hackensack. So he had agents around the country that would gather information for him. Now, the other part of that was distributing the travel guide. Remember, this is still during Jim Crow and segregation in America. So there were newsstands in black communities who could order it in bulk. You could subscribe to it, and it would be mailed to you. Pullman porters who worked on trains all around the country who may come to New York City. They would then take it and share it with other Pullman porters who would distribute it around America. And then at one point, marketing stepped in the form of a man who worked for Exxon, then called Esso.
That was the big
That was the
big
big
dog.
service station owned by Standard Oil. And Esso stations became the first stations to actually carry the Green Book. Not all Esso stations, but those that wanted to and those that were black-owned actually carried it so you could pick it up while you were on the road. There was a man named Billboard Jackson, and he was the marketing person who actually worked for Exxon as a liaison with the Green Book. And so he was the one who helped with that expansion. And there's another little known fact here. Who owned Standard Oil? The Rockefellers. The Rockefellers had been noted abolitionists. Spelman College in Atlanta is named after a Rockefeller. So it seems logical now that the Rockefellers would be much more open to this type of distribution, and they proved this because it was the first oil company in America that allowed black people to actually own the franchises.
It must have been so cool to just peel away the layers as you took this journey.
Brenda, what you say is so true. It's not just peeling back the story of the Green Book. It's when I'm out talking to people about it, gathering the personal stories, hearing their memories of that time, families who recall using the Green Book. One of my favorite stories was told to me by Hezekiah Jackson in Birmingham, Alabama. He would say he would be at home and his mother would be all at church and somebody would come and knock on the door and said, can we borrow that Green Book? And he said, well, when Mama comes back home, and they kept it in a part of the house, and people would come over where they were taking trips to visit relatives in New York or Detroit, and they would want that Green Book because, as he said about his family, when we travel, my granddaddy had the Green Book and he had his pocket Bible.
It was that important.
It was that important.
One of the things you lay the foundation right away in Driving the Green Book is that in order to understand the Green Book and the importance, you have to understand two major American events that happened beforehand.
And those two major events are the Great Migration and the creation of the automobile. From 1910 to 1970, over 6 million African Americans left the rural South to move north and west to new opportunities. Much of this migration was also prompted by the terrorism that African Americans were experiencing in the South with lynchings, draggings, and drownings. But the other component was the new jobs up north that paid more money than they could ever earn living on a farm. So all of these people from the South, African Americans, moved there for this opportunity. Because they were earning more money, many of them were saving that money. And one of the indications that you had made it was that you were able to buy your own car. It wasn't just a status symbol. It was the thing that enabled you to avoid the frustrations of traveling on public transportations, much of which was segregated. So if you knew that hotel wasn't going to let you stay there, you drove past it. You didn't have to take the bus or the train to sit in the Jim Crow car, which was right behind the engine, to experience the coal, dust, and smoke. You could get in your car and go. And you would buy a big car, a powerful one. Why? Because you couldn't stay at hotels along the way. So if you needed to rest or you were traveling with your children, you wanted someplace where they could rest. That became your domain. And also, there's an important footnote from that period. African Americans found it difficult to buy houses. Although this was post-World War II prosperity, the federal government had policies that discouraged the mixing of the races in housing, and banks redlined areas where they would not make loans, and these areas were largely black communities. So for many black people, the thing that you could buy yourself, the thing that you could own and take your pride in, was your car.
And now you really needed that car because your family was miles and miles and states away because of this cataclysmic change.
Yes. And you wanted to go back home. You wanted to see grandma. You wanted to visit your uncles and aunts. Maybe it was, the Easter time when you know they're going to have great food, a wedding or a funeral. So you wanted to go back to be in touch with people. And the car gave you that freedom. Now you didn't have to wait for the bus or the train. You could get on the road. Your time was yours for the first time.
One of the things, too, though, is it was a learning experience of parents teaching their children the realities of what they were going to face as they got older and drove. And you've so many vivid memories in there from children of seeing these interactions.
One of the beautiful lessons to come out of this book is an understanding of how African American parents sought to protect their children from the horrors of racism, from the debilitating effects. The stories are beautiful sometimes, how parents use themselves as shields. But all parents knew that they could only protect you so much. Two stories sort of live in me. One is with Brian Stevenson, who is the director and founder of the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. He talked about his memories of his grandfather, and he said that his grandfather, as a man, wanted to model a behavior for him. But when he saw his grandfather in front of white people and how he changed, it disturbed him. And he said, and he knew his grandfather was trying to protect him, but that behavior in front of white people was the way that he protected him. And the grandfather literally became much more subservient. The other story I remember is when Hezekiah Jackson and his family drove to Detroit after his mother's sister, Aunt Beattie, died. When they got there, the family in Detroit didn't have a car. So they asked Hezekiah's father and mother to go to Aunt Beattie's employer to be able to pick up the paycheck. And as they pulled up to the white family's house, it was almost like the police came out of nowhere and said to his father, "What are you doing in this neighborhood, boy? Right? Are you up here to steal something? Where do you get this nice car? Did you steal it for some white family, or do you work for some white family?" He recalled it vividly. But for me, the part of the story that stays with me was his brother's reaction. His brother turned to Hezekiah and said, "Did you hear that white man call Daddy boy? Did you hear him call Daddy boy?" They had so much respect for their father, and he was so respected in the community where he lived that would never happen. Hezekiah said his brother almost lost it. And I remember thinking, his brother was collateral damage in that situation. What was his brother's relationship with police and such authority figures after that? How did that play out throughout his life? Those stories have stayed with me, especially when you see what appears on television today with some of the police stops. I can't watch them because I always think about Hezekiah Jackson's brother.
That was the day life changed.
It was, because black parents all knew there would be a day when you could no longer protect your children from the realities of racism and bigotry. It was a day every black family dreaded, but they knew that day would come. And as my parents did, you tried to give your children an understanding that this is not necessarily about you personally. This is about the way the outside world views you. But as a child, it's hard not to internalize that hurtful message. Everybody can tell you the first time somebody called them the N-word. Everybody can, because it was a moment of change.
You also opened up this window to this beautiful sort of community that took care of each other. This is a story of Black ingenuity, of reinvention, of entrepreneurship, of survival, of helping and taking care of one another.
African Americans wanted to be part of the American dream. We wanted the same thing for our children. We wanted the same thing for our futures. We wanted our lives to be better. We wanted to be able to live in nice houses. But segregation and Jim Crow and certain financial practices prevented that. So with the limited resources that African Americans had, we built our own.
Tell me about the businesses that populated the Green Book and that made these journeys possible and enjoyable too.
In every town and city across America, there was an area that was locally referred to as a Little Harlem. Walnut Street in Louisville, Kentucky, Jefferson Street in Nashville, the Avenue, Jefferson Davis Avenue in Mobile, Alabama, Farish Street in Jackson, Mississippi. This is where the entrepreneurs built pharmacies, record stores. There were doctor's offices, law offices, eateries, restaurants, nightclubs. Whatever Black Americans imagined, they saved their money, often from working factory jobs, in order to open these places. And they showed what they could do on a shoestring. That old statement, making a way out of no way, is personified in the entrepreneurial efforts that came out of this. These were places of Black excellence. They were also the economic energies of many of these towns. People wanted those services. African American entrepreneurs provided them.
Reading this brought me back to a time where your family vacation was going to see your cousins and sleeping on the floor.
Yes.
It was really caring about those connections. It was like a bittersweet to see what's been lost, and yet beautiful to hear the people you interviewed reliving that.
It is, because for many of them, they still keep these small rituals up in ways that they can. When I go home, I still visit all my relatives. You know, some of them still make my favorite cornbread or my favorite fried fish. I don't go back as often as I used to, but it's a real touching moment. It's a real touchstone in my life, that the smells, the tastes, the way the house looks, it all takes you back, and it nurtures you, and it reminds you of where you came from, the good parts of where you came from.
And the Green Book helped make that possible.
And the Green Book helped make that possible.
And the Green Book also changed America in a much broader sense because it contained crucial information on the laws regarding discrimination and segregation.
It was called Know Your Rights, and it was a state-by-state listings of the rights in those states after the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Not surprising, not all the states were listed, because many states continued to ignore the law in their day-to-day practices. But Victor made Black people aware of what was available to them.
Sharing this information created the next breakthrough.
Sharing the information saved lives, but it also made the next generation aware of the promises that had been made that had not been fulfilled. And it empowered them to say, why don't we have these rights? Why are we still fighting this? Why should I still be in this subservient role? So it provided the momentum that became part of the civil rights movement.
So as the Green Book itself was sort of fading out, a new movement took place.
Victor always wanted there to be a time when the Green Book would no longer be necessary. In fact, he wrote about that in the book. And he said that he would publish this until the laws changed and opportunities existed equally for Black people in America. As the civil rights movement was building, Victor covered it in certain parts, talking about the various breakthroughs that different organizations had brought to civil rights. So I would say that it was more desegregation that killed off the Green Book. The civil rights movement continued, but the need for separate accommodations was diminished.
Where do you want your readers to go next on this trip?
I want the reader to see my book as opening doors to other personal stories as well as other resources about the Green Book. One resource that people may not think about is their own families. Maybe there's somebody in your family who knew somebody who used the Green Book. Maybe they've had an on-the-road encounter that they've not spoken about. Talk about those things. Talk about some of the subjects that are covered in the Green Book. I hope that curiosity leads people to explore other books like Candace Taylor's Overground Railroad. There's a children's book by Calvin Ramsey. There's also the Schomburg's online digital resources of all of the Green Books in its collection that you can go through page by page. Also, if you're in Washington, D.C., people should go to the Smithsonian African American Museum of History and Culture and go to see the Green Book exhibition there. At every step, you're going to learn something, not just about how Black people survived and the ingenuity of that period, but you'll learn something new about American history. The stories that I capture in this book, the stories that people generously shared with me, were intended to pass wisdom on to me when I was sitting there, and now I'm passing that wisdom on to my reader, because I know that every single person I interviewed and talked to would want me to do that.
How did this journey change your life?
While writing this book, I frequently thought about the fact that almost none of my relatives with whom I went on any of my road trips are still alive. Often when I was talking to somebody in an interview, I would hear my grandmother's voice and cadence. I'd hear my uncle's son's cadence and his slow, deliberate way of talking. And it was like an incredible gift. And my editor did something that was really touching for me. She put a picture of me in the book. When I was 4 or 5, a picture was taken. I'd never seen that picture. My nephew found that picture. And then a friend had it enhanced. And my editor decided to put that picture in the book. And I always say that's an homage to all of my relatives who protected me in the small Black community in the South where I was loved and given an open heart to make this journey.
Thank you so much, Alvin Hall.
Thank you, Brenda.
Thanks again for watching, and please give this video a thumbs up and keep an eye out for our next HEC Books interview. To get notified when it comes out, click the subscribe button.